Hello, and welcome to the second episode of the Stay Creative podcast. I'm your host, Jeremy Brady. Today, we get a chance to sit down with Earl Carlson, a multidisciplinary artist, designer, creative, currently the senior design manager at Docker. And there's two things when you meet Earl that are immediately apparent. One, laid back. Number two, a high intentionality to the creative work that Earl builds, not just with himself as an artist and designer, but with the teams that he leads. And so we talk about those two core aspects that a team needs to make great creative work. Number one, play. Number two, exploration. But before any of that can happen, you need to have trust. So we unpack what it means to build that trust so free play can happen. Underlying all of that, though, the heartbeat of this is really making sure not to fall into cynicism. Creatives, everybody, we all have ups and downs, peaks and valleys, but it's important to always stay optimistic, to always bring that joy. So join us today as we chat with Earl about this topic and more in our second episode of the Stay Creative podcast. You're listening to Stay Creative, a podcast where I chat to all types of creatives and find out how they're able to stay curious, stay passionate, stay hungry, how they all are able to stay creative. Join me, Jeremy Brady, as we discover old and new ways to stay creative. Hey, Earl, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining us today. I'm just really excited to sit down with you today and talk about so much, just in terms of your history with design, your kind of outlook and just staying optimistic. Talk a little bit about boundary setting, when to say no, and how we come to that. But before we kind of get into all of it, for those of you who haven't met you, haven't heard of you, maybe you can give us a little bit of your background, a little bit of your bio.
Yeah. So first off, thanks for having me. I am a multidisciplinary creative. I know everyone throws that term around these days, but I really dabble in a bunch of different things. I work in music. I do installations. I do UX design, UI design. I do some industrial design as well. Honestly, a little bit of everything. Live in Michigan now. I was born and raised here, moved around a bunch, and then came back. And in my professional life, I manage teams. I manage teams of UX designers and try to encourage them to also be optimistic and look for the best things that they can be doing.
Well, first off, let me say I'm sorry. I'm sorry for your loss as a someone in Michigan for the Detroit Lions. Just a moment of silence for the Lions. Sorry about that. So speaking of optimism in the face of loss. Sorry to bring it up again. As someone who just seems really innately curious, just like you talk about multidisciplinary design, it sounds like you're just sort of like, hey, I want to kind of dig into this. I want to dig out. Where does that come from? Is it curiosity, or what's the thing that's sort of driving you to kind of explore all those different worlds?
Yeah, so growing up, I didn't have a lot of space for play. I didn't have a lot of space for like hanging out with kids, all of that stuff. I was like raised like in the middle of nowhere, and frankly was one of the few Black kids for miles and miles. And I've had to learn play. I've had to learn how to have fun and collaborate and do a bunch of these things. And as I've done that, I've found so much joy and interest. And it's almost like I was afraid when I first started doing music that at some point I would learn a lot about music and then I just kind of like lose track of the thing and just kind of get over it. And instead, like all it's done is opened up that as one of the many play spaces. And that's true for so many different things. Like as soon as I start asking them the question, more questions come up and I get to meet more people doing cool stuff. And honestly, like it's just become more of a way of life over the past probably decade or so.
That's really interesting in terms of just like the investigative nature that you have, where you're kind of peeling back these questions and you're talking about, learning to play, learning to do this. And, when we think about, just managing or leading teams, especially as you're mentioning, like, hey, you're trying to lead teams with optimism, who was there to teach you to be a leader? Or was that something similar where you were like, you know what, like, I'm just going to pick up things along the way. Like, what was that process for you as you were kind of learning to become a leader?
Yeah, I would say it's a mixture of both. Lots of little things that I picked up along the way where I would just like see somebody doing something and be like, oh, that feels good. Like their team looks like they're healthy and happy and doing cool work. A lot of it's conversations with friends that are also in the space and just learning from them. But there's definitely a few people in particular that I worked underneath that like to this day I still have conversations with somewhat regularly, and I feel like I learn so much from them every time that I have those conversations.
Mm.
And a lot of it too came from just reaching out and being like, hey, you want to do a catch up? Like we don't have to, it doesn't need to be work focused. It doesn't need to be leadership focused, but just because that's the way their brain works, like oftentimes we end up down those paths. And I come back just so energized and like being like, oh, awesome. I can like put this into the way that I do things.
That's interesting. And just in terms of like, it sounds like you've really kind of picked up these great people along the way, these mentorship, terms of a roster. So you have folks that you're like, oh, I can kind of turn to. Is that fair to say? Like you have that kind of in this sort of ability to keep coming back to go, okay, I can use you as a sounding board.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel so grateful for it. And it's one of the things that I try to be conscious of as well as I move forward, of just trying to open up some of those doors for people that I've worked with in the past, or anybody that like might want to talk about these things, recognizing that it's so important in any culture to be able to kind of give back and to not just show up and take.
That part of take is especially interesting to me because, as part of a leader who is, somebody who's trying to encourage play, trying to encourage optimism. So on one hand, that's great, right? That's fantastic. We all want our teams to be able to have that, to have this focus and intention, and then just to be able to play, to have that space. How do you create that space in the face of possibly overwhelming odds where you're like, oh shit, like we got to do this like now. How do you create that bubble or that protective layer where play can exist?
Yeah, the first thing that I try to do anytime that I'm starting up a new team or joining a new team is just work to create trust and really get to know people. The last team that I was managing, I knew more or less like when people were looking to leave the company, what their plans were afterwards, all of that stuff. And that came from this deep sense of trust. So then once you have that layer of trust and they know that you have their back and it's honest and true, then sometimes like the realness of it is you're just like, yeah, no, like this is going to suck. Like this is just going to be a slog. Like we're going to get through this, but like, yeah, it just is what it is. On the flip side, you work to build the trust upwards as well and just be like, hey, these are creatives, like where you need space and time, and you start crafting that out with the people around you, setting the expectations for how your team works, setting up the like milestones and posts and just being like, hey, like we need this amount of time to go explore this thing. And we're going to make some mistakes. We're not going to deliver the perfect thing. And over time, the rest of the business, the rest of the organization, or if you're just working, if you're in a band or something like that, everyone starts to understand how that team works within the organization. And if you can deliver like amazing results, then they're like, cool, okay, you guys do what you need to do.
Great. So you kind of not just earning the trust of the folks that are on your team, the folks that you're like leading into the fog, into the ambiguity that is creative, but also like, hey, we've got to demonstrate or show, and once we do, that kind of gives you the ability to even create a bigger space for your team. It sounds like to say, hey, just like leave us to the thing. We don't know what it's going to be, but there's trust built up that they can say, okay, I don't need to know everything. I just know that you're working on it.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a person at a company that I worked at, and when he would focus on a team, it was joked that it was the Eye of Sauron looking down. And the way that I worked on that was I straight up just at the end of every day just badgered him with an email that was super long about every single thing that my team did, and not like from a place of I'm going to micromanage and look over at their tasks, but just by keeping an eye on what they're up to every single day. And over time, he stopped responding to the emails. The first week was rough. Like the first week was like just me spending an hour every morning going through like all of the feedback. But yeah, after that, like he backed off. He was just like, oh, okay, this team knows what they're up to. This team has got it under control.
I love that. I love that. I can just sort of hear a sort of a death metal sound of like status. Just
Totally.
like, don't even try. Like, we got this. Like, really, really just like, hey, we're on this, which is like that, that aspect, in my world, we had a similar kind of thing we did. And knowing that, catching more flies with honey versus vinegar, we did a creative newsletter. And you're like, oh, great, another email. Fantastic. Thank you for ruining my inbox. No, what we were trying to do was like be funny, like, which is always hard, be informative about the work that we were doing, and also just really be conscious about bringing people along for the ride. So we would have headlines like everyone asks where their creative is, but no one asks truly how creative is doing. And like a little teardrop, and gifts from the office, and just being literally tongue in cheek with that. But it sounds like, hey, that transparency really allowed that space to happen, and folks finally were like, okay, I can leave you be. I want to move from that a little bit, which is just talk about the trust, you're building with your team. So not just trust with the folks that leadership, quote unquote, further up. How do you build that? I know you kind of talked a little bit about like, hey, I'm not going to blow smoke here. That it is what it is. We got to work through it. Like, what are like other ways that you're building that trust with your team?
Yeah, I mean, again, the first thing is just kind of being real with them. I want to get to know people that are on my team, because we're not just designers. We're not just, pushing pixels or doing flows or doing whatever. Like, we're whole ass people coming into work. And we spend a bunch of time together. So we may as well get to know each other and hang out a little bit, and acknowledge that there's going to just be stuff going on in everybody's life, especially, I mean, for anybody that went through the pandemic. Clearly,
what was this? I'm sorry. Was there a thing that happened that we all...
Just a small thing. Yeah. It was easy to miss.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I just like sometimes just block that entire part of my life out of my mind. But sorry, continue.
But yeah, I mean, it was a really interesting thing, because we saw this like massive flattening of people's lives, where it wasn't just you go into an office and your whole world is encapsulated in that, almost like Severance in some ways. And instead it turned into, oh, there's a kid on camera, or, oh, somebody is just like struggling through some stuff and you see it in real time. And I think that that's actually really beautiful. And I encourage all of my teams to kind of bring that good part from this horrible time into the world, and into their work world. The other thing is, I just want them to like have an opportunity to shine and like show up, because they're doing all this hard work. Sometimes it can like, you can get lost in the weeds, and it's like, let's celebrate that stuff. Kind of like the newsletter you were talking about. Like, let's just find all of the ways that we can like bring more people into the fold, to just be like, look at the cool shit that these people are doing. They're working hard. Yes,
absolutely. Yeah. I think that what I'm hearing there is really the honesty of just, we say it, we hear it, the whole person, bring your whole self to work. And it sounds like to do that too, you're investing a lot of yourself, as you certainly should, into really digging deep with folks.
Yeah. It's so important for me. Again, like, we spend so much time with all of the people that we work with. Like, why am I going to put up some sort of barrier? Yeah. And it's tough. Like, it becomes really tough sometimes, especially when somebody's going through something, like as a manager, as a leader, where the only thing that I can offer is just an ear, like, and just kind of be there. And I always want to try to fix things, but like, it's such an important thing to be like, no, I need to take a step back. I don't need to fix this. Like, this person just needs a place.
I mean, that's really interesting that you mentioned that, like the sort of wanted desire to fix stuff. So it, it sounds like you're kind of learning to create space for things just to live.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
how do you do that? Like, is like, what's your, like, do you know, how did you, like, well, I guess what I'm saying is, like, first, like, how did you come to that kind of realization that you needed to do that? And then two, like, what are the practices or ways that you're creating space?
I mean, without like getting super deep into the backstory, I look at my family now and I realize that there's not always a lot of space that's created in the dynamics. I've had a lot of conversations with my mom, which have been horrifying at times, not because she's brought any energy, but just because I'm afraid of the conversations. She's been super receptive to it and created a lot more space for me. But realizing that those dynamics were at play and realizing what I needed, through therapy, through like doing so many different things, I started to understand that it's like, oh, right, like I'm not the only one. And maybe there's a different way of doing it. Honestly, even doing couples therapy with my partner was incredible for that as well. Realizing that so many times, again, that fix it mentality comes through in a relationship. And then it's like, no, actually, maybe I just need to take a step back and listen and just be here and support. And transfer that over into like all areas.
Yeah. And that doing the work, which it sounds like, a lot of that's what you're talking about is like, hey, I'm putting the work in, I'm doing the work. And then that's both in my personal life and professional life, that's showing up, and you're showing up in the way that it allows you to do that. Taking the clock back just for a second, coming up, you mentioned talking about leaders and folks that you've found along the way. I don't know about you, but I felt the way that we kind of came up was entirely different than the world we're in now in terms of what leaders need to be or should have been. Like, from a contrast and comparison, like, what's an example or time if you're like, oh, when I was coming up, like, this is kind of what the world was. Like, can you paint a picture of like the past for those who weren't there?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that this is in every industry, in every space, but like people tend to just be a little bit more aware and sensitive, and just even the fact that like therapy is a conversation is wild, and mental health. And I think that, in the past, it felt like there was time and space to do a little bit more work, to spend time before having to ship something out. It felt like there was more experimentation in play, especially when we think of like any sort of like web UI or anything like that. Like I'm thinking like back in Flash days where like a website could be anything. Like it had to be, 640 pixels wide or whatever, but it could be anything in those 640 pixels. And we're starting to see like the flattening a lot of that space, which is great for accessibility, great for a number of reasons, but also makes for a really boring experience if you're on the web at all. So it's like there's so many different layers that are different. And I think that there's a lot of pros to where we're at right now. I think that there's obviously a bunch of stuff that I look back on with like rose tinted glasses. I'm like, man, it was so good back in the day. But like also there's a lot of stuff that sucked back then.
Yeah, and you're like, wow, that was a lot of, and I'm definitely going to project here, like, wow, there's a lot of hours of my life that I cannot get back. But with Flash, you could like make anything. I just remember every site almost feeling completely different. But also like completely, and Jacob Nielsen is like probably like, this is exactly what I was talking about. Like all buttons need to be blue. And you're like, whatever, dude, like we're going to do it our way. And you're going to have to find the button. It's a discovery to click. Skip intro will be your life. These are the testaments of how we will make websites. And the idea now, which is funny because the amount of time you would spend on site versus where we are today with potential doom scrolling, but just the contrast and compare. But, Flash nostalgia aside, the way websites were built, the way we were creating, I just want to kind of take a moment and also just celebrate, speaking of celebrating, just the fact that therapy, yes, is like a legitimate conversation. It's a part of benefits now. It's it feels normalized. Before, I don't know if this was your experience, but like we didn't have therapy, we had cigarettes. So, you know, like that was okay.
Right.
Like, go smoke these things that eventually will kill you. To versus like, hey, actually, let's unpack what's really going on versus doing that. Do you coming back to like the differences in terms of the sites and just the creative overall versus where we are now? There's a lot of conversation. Certainly I'm talking about it. Some other people are talking about it where things look the same.
Mm-hmm.
You're like, oh, I'm going to go buy a car. You're like, they all look the same. So just
Mm-hmm.
choose the SUV that has this other curve.
Yeah,
Is
man.
that is that coming up for you? And like, how do you think? And not that we're going to solve it here today, but how do you think we start to break out of this, or really like what's causing everything just to look the same?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is people make profit, and then once you make profit, it starts to become scary to do something outside the norm,
Mm,
because there's that curve. Like you have to get people bought into the new thing, and then once you see it, like then it's like, yeah, we'll start selling more units, we'll start pushing more, whatever. There's also all of the accessibility concerns. Thinking about
mm,
cars, especially being back in Michigan. Um, it's been interesting to see where just like, right, cars are super safe right now. Like
mm,
fundamentally changing the design of a car is really difficult because we've gotten to a point where they are just so incredibly safe. But then you see a new design language come out, like what's happening with electric vehicles, and
mm.
like, no offense to anybody that is working at like toiling over making new designs for electric vehicles, but like that design language is not great. Like I just think that there's such an opportunity to do something interesting, and instead we're just like, well, here you go, here's something that's like different but like worse maybe, design language wise. So
Mm.
that's been strange. But coming back to your question around the flattening of everything, I think that that is 100% an issue, but I also think that that creates a lot of opportunity, and we're going to see
Mm.
it over the next 5 years, where people are going to start breaking out from that and creating unique identities just based on the fact that they're not using the same hamburger menu, that they're not using, whatever patterns are currently happening. And if you dig deep enough into like any platform, Instagram, Pinterest, Tumblr, whatever, you start seeing some of the like punk rock shit
Mm.
that's actually going on already. Like people are doing cool stuff, but it's just not at the surface. Like the surface is just all the same. And then you dive down and you're like, whoa, what happened? How did I get here? Like it's a weird Yahoo group almost, like to throw it back.
I love that. I love that. Like these sort of deep, sort of subreddits of that. Is that without going in and popping the hood on the algo? Is that basically just we're getting fed stuff that isn't disruptive because that's what the algo thinks we want versus like, no, I want that cool ass shit that like punk rock stuff. Is that what's happening? And we're just
Hmm.
basically caught in an echo chamber. But if you break, you're saying like, hey, you can actually break through that, but you gotta dig for it.
Yeah, I think you have to be a bit more intentional, because, like, most of the algorithms are just like based on engagement. So if
Mm,
I'm spending more time on posts that are safe, then it's going to be like, well, here you go. Here's your explore feed. It's all the stuff that you spent like half a second on over the past year. So it's like I've intentionally started pushing my algorithms a little bit differently, of just being like, oh, I'm going to like some of this weird stuff and start on Instagram, like start creating collections of some strange stuff. And it's starting to like respond to that as well. So it almost becomes this like really strange conversation as opposed to the doom scrolling or just the kind of like mindless, like open it up and just, whatever is there, I'll eat.
yeah, you eat. Well, I like the hijacking of like your algo or like customizing. You're like, okay, like I know what's happening here. I'm going to kind of get that. So beyond like the doom scrolling and some of the things that we're seeing out there, um, you know, how do you, or I guess, do you find yourself in that kind of loop, in that sort of, and how do you break out of that loop? Do you catch yourself and you go, oh, I'm stuck in this this doom scroll pattern? Like, what's the thing that you're like, oh, I consciously do this or do this to break out of that?
Yeah, I catch myself a little bit in it, but it's less doom scrolly these days. A bit of my background, I worked at Facebook on the news team. My first week in office was Trump's first week in office. It was a clusterfuck.
Yeah.
He's coming back. Great. Love it. Yeah. So after seeing that, after seeing where the news industry is and was, I just cut it cold turkey. I was just like, I'm not engaging with news in the ways that I have been. Like, there's nothing here that's bringing me like any sort of joy or making me happy about how things are moving forward. And I've been really selective about how I've been bringing it back in. And a lot of that's community as well. Just like when friends send stuff over, I'm just like, oh, okay, like I'll jump into this and like read this article because this is interesting. And that's helped a lot with the doom scrolling side of things, honestly. Like, it's so easy to be cynical these days. And cynicism, like, is the antithesis of action for me anyway. And I'm just like, I was cynical for like so many years. I'm just fucking tired of it. Like, I'm just like, nah, like that's a waste. When we're talking about like, what's a waste from the past? Or like, you know, all the hours that we've spent doing something, it's like, that's actually the thing. If I could get back those hours that I was cynical.
That's really, really interesting. I mean, the idea that it's not just like what you were doing, but how you were feeling or how you're approaching the world. And just to kind of even take a step back even further, you're talking about your time at Facebook and like the first week you're there. Oh, wow. So you're like, whoa, okay. So you like got a really up close look at the ghost of the machine. And you were like, yeah, I'm going to drag that shit to trash. Like, that's not for me. Like, yeah, no, good. I'm good. So, so it's funny too, because you know, I think there's like a Henry Miller quote, without pulling some obscure author quote, just about basically like, if you can be optimistic, like that's half the game here. If you can get older and stay optimistic, especially for those of us who have really been really close to the machine, you know, that is that's powering part of the internet. Let's face it, it might have gotten away from us. The community aspect, you know, like tapping into community, that's really interesting to me. Like, is that in part of what it's been a really nice kind of through line, just even in our conversation, is the intentionality that you bring, whether it's how you stay open. How intentional have you been in terms of like cultivating community? Has that been something you're like, okay, this is definitely going to do, or has that just been sort of an organic process for you?
It's been really, really intentional for me. It wasn't always. And some of the things that I started realizing was how important the people that I'm spending time with are. And that didn't mean that I'm cutting out relationships or anything like that. It meant more so that I had real serious conversations with some friends of just being like, hey, like this is where I'm at right now. And this is the stuff that I'm interested in. And really seeing like a bunch of people show up, like, and maybe some of the friendships, you know, might have slowed down or we might have pulled away a little bit, but there are certain friendships. One of the groups of friends, we do a song every day for the month of January. It's called January. It is a marathon, and I'm so glad to be done with it because we're recording at the end of January right now. It's the last day. It has been so intense, but the whole thing started because a friend and I were kind of interested in music, didn't know what we were doing. We started doing it, you know, 5 years ago, I think. I brought 2 more people on throughout the years. And every single day we work on these tracks, but then we also spend time listening to each other's tracks. And that is more meaningful than anything, is that attention that we give one another. And it's so much fun. And yeah, it's just like those friendships and those things really get lifted in a way that has been really beautiful for me.
Just to hear you talk about the editing that's happening in your life, where you're being really conscious about like, okay, I'm going to put this down. I'm going to pick this up, you know, whether if that's, hey, I'm just going to going to cold turkey. I'm going to cut this shit out. Like I don't need it. It's not giving this sort of dieting, this editing that's happening, and doing that with people too, which is, really can be hard, where you're saying, hey, this isn't for me anymore. And I guess that kind of brings us to like another part of just knowing a little bit about your background, which is really part of this is boundary setting and saying, okay, this is a no, this is a yes. And I guess I would just want to explore that a little bit with you, just in terms of like, how did you kind of get to that place of being able to actually say no to things? Or was that just something that came naturally to you? Or was that a learned kind of behavior that you had to kind of come to?
Dude, I struggle with it every single day. Like, I have some friends that are so good with this, where it seems like it's just effortless to them to just be like, no, I'm good. And then just move on. And for me, it's like, there's the anxiety loop around it. There's like so many different parts of it, but it is so important. I feel like the first time that I was kind of given permission to set boundaries was at onboarding for a company, where somebody was just like, hey, you can say no to any meeting. And in fact, you should say no to most meetings because you will get overloaded with meetings here. And I was just like, wait, I can say no to meetings? Like, and I started trying it, and like, it was just like easy. Like I just press no on a calendar. I don't have to think about it at all. And people started really like understanding that and respecting that. And I think that it was just like small, tiny steps of finding places where it's like, how can I express a boundary here? And seeing that maybe it rubs up against somebody. And other times where it's like I express a boundary and it causes massive conflict. And realizing even in that like the people aren't going to abandon me if I set a boundary, and the people that do abandon, like maybe we shouldn't be as close as we were anyway. Like, yeah.
That part that you're talking about, where you're like, I can almost see in my mind's eye where you've been told, hey, I can say no to a meeting, and your hand is kind of wavering over the mouse before you click no. And like all times, was that just anxiety inducing, or was that relieving? Like what were the, because it sounds like that was the first really moment you're like, what, I can say no to shit? And like,
yeah, definitely a lot of anxiety the first time. Like and the other thing too is it's like I was probably like 32, 31, something like that when I learned this, which as an aside, I feel like a lot of people are just like, man, I'm 40, I'm 50, I'm 60. Like I'm too late to figure these things out. And I'm just like, nah, like as long as you got life left, like we can change, like we can work on these things that don't serve us. But yeah, no, like deep anxiety was the like main feeling. Like honestly, like when it's not joy and optimism, like anxiety is like another big like participant in my life, and I'm always learning ways of working with that.
Yeah, you're like, anxiety has entered the chat. Hello, anxiety. How are you doing? Player one, Doom, is now challenging you to a face-off. What are you going to do, Earl? How are you going to live? Well, just like hearing all that in the face of the anxiety and the doubt and the things that I think a lot of folks, certainly I can relate to, and then choosing consciously not to be cynical about things, choosing to say, yeah, I am going to change this because sure, like I might have had a learned behavior all the way up to 32, but like, F it. I'm going to move away from that. The teams that you have led and managed, how have you brought back just even that idea of saying no into the team? Have you done that? Have you been really a big advocate for that, or no?
Yeah, I try to be. I think that the meeting thing is always the first one where I'm just like, if you feel like you don't need to be in a meeting, like you can say no to it. If it gets escalated up to me for whatever reason, like we can all have a conversation about it. I know as well though that I've like learned some lessons where one designer on my team in particular was always getting pulled into different things. And they were really interested in a bunch of the projects as well. But then, 2-3 months later, they'd come to me in a one-on-one and just be like, hey, I'm like so stressed. I've got too many things, too many pieces going on. And I had to learn through that experience that it's like not just meetings, obviously. It's like, how do we set bounds and understand what the expectations are going to be for somebody jumping into something new, and both give them the power to say no to something. And then also, as a person that's kind of got an overview and gets to see some of the patterns and habits that people are involved in, being like, hey, maybe this isn't the thing that you should take on right now. Like, and having a conversation with them that's, gentle but serious, and like just being like, hey, you got a lot on your plate, and also in 2 months, like the project that you're working on, it's probably going to blow up in some way. We don't need to take on something new.
Right. And that's coming back to the aspect of building trust with people and putting in that work. It sounds like, that's what enables that conversation to happen, or in a way that's a little bit more fluid, versus if you were just, what I think we might have experienced, the swoop and poop, as I like to call them, leaders who didn't put in the work, maybe can't have those conversations in a way that's actually like, hey, like, no, I legit care about you. And this is a hard conversation potentially, but it's the right conversation.
Yeah.
It's the right conversation. So as we have these conversations as part of this thing, I like to end each one of our chats really with a kind of hallmark of what this is, knowing that we're all having to do more with less. And one thing that you would encourage people to do to stay creative, what would that be?
Yeah. Ta-Nehisi Coates had an interview and he was like, yeah, people always ask me, what can I do to change the like race relations that are going on right now? And he's like, nothing. Like, we're not building it for tomorrow. We're building it so that our grandchildren, our great grandchildren, like everybody moving on forward is in a better place. Like, you can't do anything to change it tomorrow though. And I think about that a lot from the creative aspect, from all parts of life, where trying to do something original, trying to do something new, and pretending like we're outside of the flow of time and the flow of like all things that humans have done, like that's crazy. It's actually an insane act. It's instead like embrace it. Like, think about hip hop culture. Hip hop culture explicitly was just like, yeah, no, I love this 2-second sample. We're going to play it on 2 records back to back, and then have somebody just do some like silly raps over the top. And look at what it's become today. So staying creative, it's like find community, be optimistic, know that things can change for the better and that you can be part of that change, and don't try to do anything new. Like, try to find something that's fucking cool that like really resonates with you for whatever reason. And then just do that, like do something like that. Try to play, try to make mistakes, and just have fun with it.
I love that. I think, especially just that note of like, we are in the moment we are in, and just be here, and coming back to the punk rock ethos and some of the things that are just like, start small and build your way up. Well, I want to end it here, but before I do, I just want to thank you for your time today, Earl. Thanks for showing us a little bit of ways of you've grown in terms of finding optimism for yourself and staying creative.
Thanks, man. This is a lot of fun.
It's great. It was great to have you. Thanks again, Earl. Peace out.